What's up, Internet? It's Matt at Overkill Woodcraft, and today I'm going to show you in depth how I made these Freedom Seed side tables. Now, even if you're not looking to make something exactly like this with, a dried up wood cookie slab and spent ammo casings, this video is still going to be loaded with all kinds of tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years when it comes to working with epoxy. And then I'll also go over in detail how I got this nice contrast between the satin wood grain and then that high gloss or glass finish on the epoxy. So stick around and we'll get to it. I lost the original footage, but about a year or so ago, I ended up having to cut down this super sketchy white oak, and I didn't realize it at the time, but it was completely hollow. So after I cut it down, something along the lines of these side tables just instantly came to mind. So I probably could have started working with the wood right then and there, because this tree had to have been dead for, 5 to 10 years while it was rotting out. But I just went ahead and I, bucked up some of those larger sections, and I cut them up into roughly 3 to 4 inch cookies and just set them aside until I had the time to make these. So after picking what I thought would be the best cookies for the job, the first thing I did was go ahead and debark them. I always debark live edge stuff, and this is why, grubs. I'll end up feeding these to my chickens here in a couple of seconds. But so I went ahead and debarked them, and I didn't worry too much about getting all the, fibers off the sides, because I'll end up flattening them on my router sled and, sanding the sides and everything later. And because these cookies were so old and dry and brittle, I had to go ahead and support the checks as much as I could. They actually broke in a couple of different sections, so I had to, glue them back together. I just used a combination of different thicknesses for Star Bond, but I glued them all together, and then just, like I said, tried to support those checks and cracks as much as I possibly could, because this had to withstand being flattened on the router sled. And then once I had the true size of the cookies, as far as the rough diameter goes, I went ahead and made what I just call kind of a epoxy containment unit. I basically treat it like an epoxy mold, just use sheathing tape and cover up all the pieces with that. And the reason why I do this is, just in case things fail, the clamps don't hold it down and epoxy starts leaking out, I've got something to contain it in. So then I went right into flattening these on my router sled. And here's just kind of my setup. Again, links for all of this are down in the description if you're interested in it. But it's just a homemade setup, really inexpensive. And then I made the cradle for it. And then I just used my Bora, I think it's a 3 horsepower router. When slabs are a little too uneven on one side for just standard double-sided tape, they have this foam tape from X-Fast, and that gives you a little bit of added height and still keeps it nice and secure. So I used that and then just shimmed up a couple of the gaps for those areas, and then just went ahead to flattening. Obviously, this always creates just a massive dust storm, so recommend PPE. Good ventilation. I would just do this outside if you could. It'll save yourself a lot of cleanup afterwards. But went ahead and I got that first side flattened, and then off camera I went and I got into all those cracks of the live edge slab, and really just I brushed it out with a wire brush and everything, and just got as much dust and debris out of there as I possibly could. And then I started preparing for the first pour, and I think I ended up using 2.5 gallons total here. But when I did this first pour, I made sure to factor in the depth. I wanted it to be at least like 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, because I knew I was going to be securing those legs with about 1 inch screws. So I factored that in, and then I just used red pigment, and then I also mixed up some black pigment. And I just decided to pour them both at the same time. When you're doing this, you want to make sure everything is clamped down as good as possible. So I've got some cawls going across, and then I also did a layer of hot glue, a bead of hot glue, I should say, in all the corners of my little containment unit. But I slacked up, and I forgot to do that around the actual piece itself. So thankfully, I did sheathing tape, and everything was contained for the most part, but it almost started wanting to leak underneath. So, I've had stuff leak out before. It's a nightmare, but thankfully everything stayed contained. So, just take all the precautions. If I was smart, I would have done like a pre-epoxy or sealed the insides of these, but I didn't, and it's okay. Now, something I did off camera was I went and I filled the tips of these casings with hot glue, and then once it was dry, I took a really sharp utility knife and just cut the ends off flush. And it was really hard to get the tackiness, like the timing of that down in my basement where it was a little bit cooler. So I kind of missed like the perfect window. I was sleeping. And when I woke up the next morning, what I did was it was still like pliable and moldable. So I just secured the casings in place with a little bit of CA glue and accelerator. And then I did another pour here. This one was just about an inch, and I didn't want to it was going to be about just over 2 inches for both pours. So I didn't want to risk, it not curing properly. I think the maximum is like 2 inches. So I just did 2 separate pours. And once this one cured, I just poured the other one, and I stopped just shy of the top. And then once it was cured, I broke it out of the containment unit. I just put that together with brad nails, so it came apart pretty easily. And then this was my first time using tuck tape instead of like your typical Tyvek tape, but it's about half the price of Tyvek tape, and it works just as well as you can see. It popped right off. And then, getting that tape off the sides is always kind of a hassle, so I like to use a heat gun just to loosen it up a little bit. It makes it much easier. And as you can see, that turned out pretty nice. So the next step was taking it to my drum sander. I could have taken this to the router sled again, but fortunately it fit right in my little baby drum sander with no problems. I think I did just 120 grit on this because I was going to end up sanding the whole thing back down to 80 afterwards. But what I did first was I took it outside and just used an angle grinder with a 36 grit flap disc. And just I love this part of the process, just shaping this up. And I mean, obviously it's not technically live edge because there's no bark on it, but just kind of giving it as much of that live edge look as possible. Obviously you want to be really careful when you're doing this because the angle grinder is, very dangerous. So after that, I went ahead and I just sanded everything up to 320 grit. And as you can see, while I'm wiping it down with mineral spirits, it was looking pretty good. And the reason why I only sanded up to this was because I wanted to spray it at first instead of doing what I knew I probably should have done, and that's going to a much higher grit, which I'll get into all of that a little bit later. But the reason why I wanted to spray it was because I didn't want that tabletop glass finish over everything, including the wood. I wanted the wood to be a satin at the most for the sheen, and then I wanted the glass for the epoxy. So I've had good results in the past using Total Boat Halcyon on epoxy projects. Like I've done, some name like monogram signs, but with those, the epoxy pour wasn't very deep. It was maybe a ½ inch, and it was also pigmented. With this, I had, 2 inches of clear epoxy followed by, the pigmented stuff in the bottom. So normally what I would do with the Halcyon is I would spray 2 to 3 coats of clear and then a coat or maybe 2 of satin. And after the clear, it was looking pretty good, but the sheen was just too glossy. So I sprayed a coat of satin, and once that dried, I knew it just wasn't going to turn out right. And to top it all off, a fly landed in the finish, even though I sprayed in a pretty contained area. So regardless, you can just see that it was not transparent enough on the epoxy part to see the casings properly. So I knew I just needed to go ahead and sand all of this off and everything and start this part over. Thankfully, while it might have been a little painstaking, I guess, and a bruise to my ego, it really wasn't that big of a deal to just run these things through the drum sander and then take them back out and go through the process with the angle grinder and, the 36 grit flap disc. And then something I forgot to mention earlier is after I took the 36 grit flap disc to the sides of that, live edge, if you will, I just went ahead and I sanded them down. I have a Surf Prep 3x4, and I just went through the grits of, I think it was coarse, medium, and fine, because I knew I was going to end up applying Rubio after that. So that ended up being, a good grit to finish off at. Now, I didn't film the sanding process, but I wanted to talk about it real quick because I know what a hassle it can be to achieve this high contrast between satin, if you will, for the wood grain and high gloss for the epoxy. And normally what that entails is you get the epoxy, perfectly glassed how you want it, and then, you're sanding the whole entire piece during that. or you're taping off the border after you get the epoxy where you want it and then sanding the wood back down. But either way, it usually involves taping off the difference between where the epoxy meets and the wood meet. And obviously with like a river table or something where it's a straight piece of wood, that is not that big of a deal. But something like this, yeah, that would be a nightmare. However, when I have this 3x4 surf prep sander that oscillates, and it really made it kind of easy, surprisingly. I didn't tape anything off. What I did was I sanded the entire thing, starting I think all the way down at like 80 or 60 grit, and then I worked my way up to, I believe it was 3,000 or 4,000 grit. All of that was completely normal sanding, dry sanding, and I water popped a few times in between, but then once I got to 3,000 or 4,000 grit, I switched over to wet sanding. And when I say wet sanding, all I was really doing was just spraying this down pretty well, nice and evenly. I wasn't like oversaturating it or anything. I was just wetting it, quick sand, nice and gentle, going through the grits, letting it dry in between each grit. And then I believe I went up to 10,000, and that's where I stopped. After that, instead of, again, having to tape off, I just took out the surf prep sander. And again, because it oscillates, but it also has these, 90 degree, your typical rectangular pads. And because there's a 90 degree, it allowed me just to come right up to the border, like really easily. And I made sure that I was careful, of course, and I just didn't overlap and touch the epoxy at all. And I didn't worry about scratching that up. And then I believe I went from coarse, medium, to fine. And that was it. And that allowed me to just go ahead and apply that one coat of Rubio. And then I thought about applying a second coat, but I was pretty happy, with the sheen that I had on this. And then after that first coat of Rubio, I waited a while, and I had like just a tiny little bit of like haze on here that is so minuscule. Like you have to shine a light directly on it to even notice it's there. But I thought, hey, I'll try to get that out. And I used a polishing compound, and it really didn't do anything for it as far as helping the haze. It just kind of dulled the wood out a little bit more, which is fine with me. But yeah, I think in this situation, the sanding to 10K was more than adequate. And then just so you can see, here's what it looked like after I sanded it to 10K, before I applied the finish, just wiping on some mineral spirits. And I mean, you can see it does not get any glassier than that. And then after that, I just went ahead and applied that one coat of Rubio. Nothing really special or fancy about how I applied it. Just used a card scraper to go ahead and, evenly distribute it. And then I just used a sponge brush for, getting the sides. And like I said, while I don't mind that polishing compound just kind of, dulled the wood grain even more, I liked it with just the one coat of Rubio on it. So if I'm bored one day, which probably won't happen, I might go back and apply another coat. Since I was more focused on the epoxy aspect of this build, I didn't film installing the table legs, but I did want to quickly talk about it and just kind of highlight a couple key things. And the first one is making sure that you factor in the length or, the depth of these screws when you're doing that first pigmented or colored pour, because these screws are 1 inch. So I made that first pour just over that at about 1.25 inches. And had I not poured that deeper, had I used longer screws, it definitely would have popped through and you would have noticed it, because as you can see, about half the screws here ended up making it into the epoxy portion of this, not just the very thick white oak. So factor that in and definitely pre-drill your holes before that. You don't want to go splitting anything. And then the other thing I did was on the underside of each of these metal pieces, and then directly on top of where they would go on the wood, I went and I marked the legs. So I did I think I did front left, front right, back left, back right, whatever system works for you, because I don't trust these holes to be perfectly in the same spot on each and every leg. So take the extra time to just go ahead and mark those in advance. And of course, you want to do all of this before you apply your finish and go through your entire sanding process as far as the pre-drilling and marking and everything goes. I did not have some sort of fancy, official, scientific way of laying these out and making sure they were perfectly spaced. I just eyeballed it, and I think that worked out perfectly here. As far as the table legs go, I bought them off Amazon and they're just your typical mass-produced table legs. You know, I thought about making my own base or turning something on the lathe, but I just really didn't have the time, one, and I also wanted the look of kind of like a beefier metal industrial style leg, but I also did not want your typical hairpin style legs because I just thought it wouldn't look very proportionate considering the top is well over 2 inches thick. So I went with these, but I'll leave a link down in the description if you're interested in them, you know, specifically, but I wouldn't recommend them because the welds are just really terrible. Like this one sits higher or proud. And then if I spin this around, you'll see like this one's just, I don't know, flush, and it's just nothing really matches up here. But surprisingly, when I put it on the ground, it doesn't wobble. They did include like some little furniture pads, which I'm sure would help with that instead of having to use like a matchbook or something old school. But yeah, I don't know. They just really weren't all that quality, and I wouldn't recommend them. And I do think they would end up scratching like the finish on a hardwood floor. Yeah. So as far as that goes, totally up to you, but I wouldn't recommend them. And that about covers everything with this build. So here's a couple mediocre glamour shots. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. And until next time, take it easy.